up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological goodness so you can think, reflect, and perhaps brew your own faith. And today on the podcast is my friend, JC himself, John Dominic Crossan. He's returning to the podcast, and this episode was recorded live at Theology Beer Camp. That's right. Last year's Theology Beer Camp, we're graced by the presence of legendary New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan. And in this episode, you're going to hear our conversation on stage right there at Beer Camp. We had a little bit of fun getting live and nerdy with 400 and some theology nerds who were rocking out some pizza and craft beverages as we talked. And in the conversation, we discussed Paul. That's right, Paul, the guy that wrote a bunch of letters in the New Testament. Well, Dom has a new book coming out real soon that is a historical reconstruction of Paul, but also one that challenges so many kind of inherited traditional pictures of Paul that you see are showing up in churches all over the place. This was a fun one, and when you hear it, you're going to say to yourself, Trip, whoa, that sounds like a lot of fun. How does someone go hang out at a place like this, Theology Beer Camp? Well, you could go to theologybeer.camp, sign up, and soon and very soon we're announcing the dates and location for Theology Beer Camp this October, the year of 2024. And if you say, what, Trip? Whoa, John Dominic Crossan, that is one excellent communicator. Well, if you go to crossanclass.com, you can join us. That's right. This Lent, we are having a class with John Dominic Crossan on the historical Jesus. Yeah, we're going to be tackling the history of Jesus, how you locate and understand him in his historical matrix. And this class will include 4 visual lectures. That's right, Dom delivering the history, wrestling, and such with high-quality pictures and examples and such right there on the screen. And we'll have 5 different live streams where, you guessed it, we'll be answering questions, engaging in the big topics and such that all of the participants are wrestling with. So if you want to join the fun, go to crossanclass.com and you'll be able to get access to the lectures and invites to all of the live streams where you or perhaps your group that you're watching the lectures with can interact, ask questions, and dig into the historical Jesus with John Dominic Crossan. I mean, he's probably only written 30 books or so on Jesus. He was only the president of the Society of Biblical Literature and ran the historical Jesus group there for a while, and one of the founding members of the Jesus Seminar. I mean, come on, like you want to come? And guess what? He's turning 90 during Lent. So there you go. Anyway, I hope you check it out. If you want to join us at Beer Camp next year, sign up. If you want to join the class, remember it's donation-based, including $0. So head over to crossanclass.com. And if you enjoy this podcast, if you enjoy the nerdy goodness, then consider becoming a regular supporting member of all we do. Homebrewedcommunity.com. On top of going to bed knowing you help make things like this possible, there's a private members feed with tons of goodies, hundreds of extra goodies, including lectures, talks, when I show up on other podcasts. There's all sorts of things end up in this members feed, all available for you, including audio from a whole bunch of the classes. So you can just listen to it just like another podcast. So head over to homebrewedcommunity.com if you want to support and make this possible. Thanks a million to all the listeners, those that share, and those that contribute. Peace.
You want to know one of the perks of already having 23 recorded hours of us talking? Is I just have to get his greatest hits triggered, and he has like a 7-minute answer that'll blow your mind, and you'll say to yourself, was that just sitting on the top of his head? And you're like, exactly how old is he? Is he at least 40? And no, he's older than that, and it's still working that fast, and he keeps it all on recall. And even everyone else here who, like his professional academics, are like, how does he still do it? Does he have some special vitamins? But I'm so excited about this. And when schedule got reworked, And I was like, I will voluntarily skip a bottle share to ask Dom questions. That's why it has to be for JC that I would skip a bottle share. Dom's working on a book right now on Paul. How many people in here have a it's complicated or worse relationship with Paul? All right. By the end of this, maybe a few of you will be leaning in the, well, he's not that horrible of a direction.
Okay.
So, Dom,
All right.
When did you first meet Paul?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Basically, I grew up in Ireland, and in Ireland, it was Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul. It was a feast day of obligation, which meant you had to go to church. It was during the summer, so it was no good for us kids. You didn't get out of school. But we tolerated Peter and Paul. Now, that's what happened to Paul. He got wrapped up in Peter and Paul. Okay? I was interested in Jesus, the historical Jesus. I was not interested in Paul. Not even negatively. It just wasn't on my horizon. Here's what happened, and it was important. In the year 2000, Marianne Borg, Marcus's wife, the late Marcus Borg's wife, had an Institute for Christian Spirituality at Trinity Episcopal in Portland, Oregon. And she said to me, Marcus, and she said, would you and Sarah like to co-host with us taking 40 people around Turkey in search of Paul? You mean we get to go free all around Turkey? Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was the first time I really started getting interested in Paul. Now, we took people around not only the places Paul actually was, like Tarsus, and Ephesus. We took him to places where you could see his world. Places he never was, but in the vagaries of time, you could see the ruins. Aphrodisias, In fact, if you ever get to Turkey, skip Ephesus, go east to Aphrodisias. Don't say I said that, though. We were taking 40 people in the ruins of the Roman Empire, not in the debates of the Reformation. Oh, dear, did Paul start to look different. Oh, wow. This is a conversion. Forget Damascus. We almost made it there, too. This is different. The first time was the year 2000. We were supposed to go in September the 19th of 2001. Didn't quite make it. Next time, 2002. Paul in the ruins of the Roman Empire with 40 Americans who had just seen the ruins of the American Empire. Oh, it was very different. It was very different. I can't stress that enough to you. It was like a conversion. So for Paul, the Roman Empire, the greatest empire there ever was, crucified his Messiah. What the hell did that say about law? Law and order crucified the Messiah. So, for example, and then I'll get back to it. In 2002, the bus left Ankara in the morning, and it was going all the way, eventually we're stopping halfway, we're going to Tarsus. So now, we're chasing Paul. We're not interested in anything else. But you can't go through Turkey and ignore those magnificent Byzantine churches 1,000 years after Paul. So we're going to stop, of course, in Cappadocia. And we're going to go into those churches built inside the tufa left from the volcanoes, like the catacombs in Rome, and see these magnificent cathedrals, miniature, size of this stage, built in there. Okay? Now, we're not there for this. But every night, Marcus and I had to give a lecture before dinner. Before dinner. First year we tried it after dinner. Oh, that doesn't work. Doesn't work. It wasn't beer, it was wine. Anyway. And I have to talk. Now, we spent the afternoon watching a Byzantine church 1,000 years after Paul. And yeah, we could recognize it. It's magnificently frescoed. You're inside your story, literally inside your story. You can recognize that's the baptism, of course. That's the transfiguration. That's the Last Supper. Everything looks the same. That's the crucifixion. All of a sudden, you see an image right next to crucifixion, where you're expecting what? The resurrection? And instead of Jesus coming out magnificent and glorious and triumphant and utterly alone, he's coming out with Adam and Eve. Those are the problem kids. He's yanking them by their limp wrists. I mean, they'll be dead a long time, you know. He's yanking them out, but that's the human race. This is not resurrection. This is the resurrection of the human race. Now, I can't ignore that when I'm giving a talk that night about the resurrection for Paul. Maybe in 2002 I might have been happy to do it. And we're going to see this again anytime we go do a Byzantine church. And we're not there for that. You'll see it in the École church in Istanbul. And we have to talk at night, what does resurrection mean for Paul? And why does he keep talking about the resurrection of the dead, as if Jesus just is kind of one of many? And if the Corinthians if the first Corinthians said to Paul, we've been reading chapter 15, and we got all this stuff about the resurrection, and we know about the crucifixion. We've seen that, so don't talk about that. Draw us a picture, Paul, of what you really mean. If we were there, what would we have seen? Like Paul, we're seeing it now. What would it be like? Would Paul have come up with the Jesus who's coming out all alone? Or would Paul have come up with something like this with the human race? That was my Pauline question. It wasn't a Byzantine art question. So some people, when Sarah and I wrote Resurrecting Easter, people thought, well, Crossan's leaving biblical studies for art history. No. What I wanted to know was how we came up with this. How did Paul come up with this? In other words, what did resurrection mean if you were hearing it with first century ears before you get to 21st century ears? Let's start with the first century.
Oh, yeah. Oh, geez. Y'all weren't anticipating that Dom's like, can we just talk about Paul and the resurrection, please? But one of the things that is really exciting to me about the work is that there's kind of like three different conversations that as you connect them, Paul's becoming more clear. One, right, is that if you look in this Byzantine art, at the very earliest art we have about the resurrection right there, it's not a picture that makes sense to Western Protestant accounts of the resurrection that we fight about, and then N.T. Wright's worried we don't believe enough and that kind of thing. It's just, it gives that symbolic image that whatever is happening in the resurrection is like the archetype of humans are popping up. And then there's that element that you talk about of that so much of the language Paul's using around what God was up to in Christ has a imperial referent. The law. Yeah. A lot of the Christological titles are connected to Caesar and such. And when you're sitting with both of those there and ask the question of the resurrection, one of the things I'm excited about in the new book is how understanding Paul as a Pharisee trying to make sense of the event brings the two together.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to kind of weave us into that.
Thank you. And understanding or thinking is just a short term for deconstruction. Deconstruction is 4 syllables, so it sounds much more. It's called thinking. but it's French. It's French for thinking. And French, French fashion. So anyway. The title of the book, Paul as Pharisee. Paul as Pharisee. Subtitle, A Vision of Post-Civilization. Let me unpack it a little bit, just for the preamble. But it is influenced, my own historicity is influencing it. So I gave you a fast view of the historicity. And we went back, by the way, every year from 2000 to 2014. when Mark unfortunately died. We went back again and again. I never got tired of going back because it was always new. Anyway, Pharisee. Okay, forget Jesus for a moment. Also don't forget. Purge your mind of the anti-Pharisaicism of the New Testament. Because here's what's going on. In the first century, under Romanization, the right wing were the Sadducees, if you're talking about political party. I'm not using this judgmentally. The right wing, quite happy with the Roman situation, collaborating. The right wing was the Sadducees. The left wing were the Essenes down at Qumran who had said, we're not even going to the temple. We don't agree with any of you guys. Who's the center? Pharisees. Why are the Messianic Jews? So Sadducean Jews, Pharisaic Jews, Essene Jews. Along come Messianic Jews. They're fighting for the center. I don't have to tell you, any of you people, that the fight in the center is a family fight and it's nastier. You don't get anything in the New Testament about the Essenes. You only hear about the Sadducees, seriously enough, at the time of the execution. But they're all about the Pharisees. They're all evil, nitpicking legalists. Here's the Pharisees. The Sadducees were perfectly happy with the justice of the world. We're doing fine here. We're collaborating with the Roman Empire. And you don't have to demonize them, by the way. They're collaborators. With all the arguments collaborators have always used throughout history. Okay. The Pharisees have come up with this idea. Now, it's an absurd idea in one sense, called the general resurrection. In Greek, it's anastasis nekron. Anastasis means rising up. It's a lovely ambiguous term, by the way. Rising up. Anastasis is the Greek word for a faction fight. Stasis. You're not just standing up, you're standing up. The Pharisees said, there is justice in this world. At the end of time, they said, at the end of time, which by the way is coming soon, at the end of time, every human being who's ever lived is going to be resurrected for judgment. Every human being who's ever lived. Resurrected for general judgment, and then they'll go off to heaven or hell. Now, that sounds horrible. I don't believe a word of it, to be honest with you. It's almost, you want to caricature it. What about cannibals? It's easy to caricature it. But what they're insisting on, there is a cosmic justice. Leave out for the moment, even if you want to talk about God. Let me put it, there may not be divine punishments, but there are human consequences. And the way I distinguish those words is if a drunk driver hits a tree and is killed, that's a consequence. Is fined by the police, that's a punishment. So consequences. Now, that's the scenario that Paul has as a Pharisee. He becomes a Messianic Pharisee. That's the proper term for the conversion. He doesn't become a Christian from a Jew. He becomes, within Judaism, a Messianic Pharisee. But to become a Messianic Pharisee, Jesus has to begin the general resurrection. That's like nuts. I mean, the general resurrection is nutty enough, but it began with Jesus. So he didn't just come out of the tomb. Everyone in the Roman Empire understands ascension. Apotheosis in Greek. It happens to emperors. They ascend among the gods. Why did they not say Jesus ascends to God? They wouldn't say among the gods. Which is exactly what the West has been saying when it calls it resurrection. Look at the imagery. Jesus is coming. Where's he going? He's going up. Now, he might stop here for a few minutes conversation, 40 days if you go with Luke, but he's going up. The whole world of the first century would understand that. They mightn't accept it, of course, but they understood that a very famous person like Moses, like Romulus, went up among the gods. Resurrection is this weird idea that there is ultimate justice in this world. Now, granted, for them, it's going to be run by God. But try and hear this almost, if you back on a minute. Do we think there are consequences for what we do in this world? In this world. And what if it started with Jesus when the Messiah, this is for their faith, the Messiah was publicly, legally, officially executed by the greatest paragon of law and order, the Roman Empire. That was the boast of the Roman Empire, you savage, like the British. We brought you law and order. We brought you civilization. And the Roman Empire crucified the Messiah? That overturned the world for Paul. So, if there is no cosmic justice, Paul would say, don't tell me it's coming soon, even soon. It has begun with Jesus. Now, if I take Paul seriously, and not literally, then what I hear is, so every human being who's ever lived is responsible for the world, including ourselves, and are being judged throughout time, and we have created heaven and hell in this world as options for life. If I read Paul through an evolutionary lens, I can bracket all of this stuff. It's at the end of time. And it's scarier stuff, far scarier stuff in terms of responsibility than any of this about, which we don't really believe in, actually. One final point. We've had all those French philosophers mentioned this morning. There's one wasn't mentioned, Alain Badiou, who is a philosopher, proudly, emphatically atheistic, because the first thing he says in his book on Paul is that I don't believe any of this stuff, about supernatural. But he thinks that Paul, if it's taken seriously, has a terribly serious message for now. I thought that used to be us. We had to make excuses to say, well, you take this little bit and that little bit. So right now, I think Paul is exactly who we want at the moment, because it's about human responsibility, corporate human responsibility across the ages, and the effect of what happens to that irresponsibility.
In that contrast that you were drawing between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, or kind of getting what's at stake in that distinction for Paul, but then the event of the resurrection and a messianic form of it changes. One of the things in the description of Sadducees is that you said, well, yeah, like collaborators or whatever, they got a list of excuses they regularly use. And I think one of the things that more and more people that would be here are coming to grips with are that we've used all sorts of excuses with religious language on it to be cooperating accommodationists to the very institutions and patterns of power that put people in our world on crosses. And then these letters from Paul, somehow when he starts talking about law and crosses, they become means to join the accommodating agenda. So could you kind of help us see the revolutionary nature of how is Paul critiquing that power form of top-down imperial power and the legitimizing of it as law when he says he's risen indeed?
All right, let me back up a little bit, and if in the process I forget what you've just asked me, come back at me.
Well, what's fun is on a podcast, this all gets edited out, and it looks like I asked the perfect next question.
I never allowed two questions anymore because I can't remember the second one. Okay, now, Paul is the terror of the New Testament. I mean, in the New Testament, forget us for a moment. If you take the 7 letters of Paul, Galatians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and Philemon, who I'm missing, 1 Thessalonians, if you take those 7, consensus of scholarship, those are where we have the real Paul, the historical Paul. Now, the other stuff is not just a penumbra circling around Paul like left over by his disciples. It's anti-Pauline stuff. It's clean-up operations. It's making Paul safe for empire. It's getting ready for Constantine in various stages. The first stage is Paul, for example, tells Philemon, you're a Christian. Fortunately, Onesimus is now a Christian. You can't have a Christian slave. Christian can't have a Christian slave. Along comes Colossians and Ephesians and says, of course you can have a Christian slave, but you should treat your slave decently. And slaves should be respectful. First stage. Along comes Timothy and Titus. Need I go on? Timothy and Titus, you know about women in Timothy. And about slaves. They take it for granted, of course. Paul's been cleaned up within the New Testament, which is important for me because I see then he was a radical. But the great de-radicalization and re-Romanization is Luke Acts. It really is. And this is not an attack on Luke. I spent 2 years studying Luke to understand him. He's writing much later, beginning of the 2nd century. And for example, read those 3 scenes, Acts 2, 22, 26, 3 attempts, the famous road to Damascus. Can't forget it. It's a cliche in our language, road to Damascus, conversion. Watch what happens. Paul is blinded by light. You can't see when you're blinded by light. Try it. But Paul spends his whole life saying, I've seen the Lord. That makes me equal to Peter, who saw the Lord. Take away the sight, and all he has is audition. Don't do that when you have a microphone. All he has, he heard, but he didn't even know who it was. He said, who are you? Luke does the final sabotage of Paul. He's not even an apostle sent by Christ. He didn't see. Terribly important, of course. The great apostle, not to the Gentiles, the great apostle. Very busy all the time, but not an apostle. So Paul is cleaned up throughout the New Testament. Now, it's impossible not to read Paul through Lucan lenses. He's too good a storyteller. It's like trying to get the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son away from Jesus. You can't do it. So once Paul is finished with Luke, you'll never see Paul again. You won't be able to see him. And Luke is much more interested in the ascension. Jesus going up. That's exactly what you'd expect as a good Roman. So part of the problem is, if you read the cross, the way most people say, can't stand that cross. It's all about Jesus, being crucified vicariously for us. What kind of a God is that? Child abuse at least. No, put Paul back, please, in the Roman world. I beg of you, put him back in the Roman world. He is speaking the language that every Roman understands. Because Roman imperial theology is the matrix against which Pauline messianic theology is an absolute collision. That's why it has to be cleaned up, to be re-Romanized a bit, gradually. So what you're getting through the New Testament is the first steps towards Constantine. There'll be a little time in between where it makes perfect sense that Constantine looked around one day and said, this makes sense. One empire, one emperor, one new city, Constantinople, one religion. But Paul has to be cleaned up. Now, it starts in the New Testament, and the final steps are all those images of Peter embracing Paul. Peter's not so threatening. So Peter embraces Paul. And now we have the hero twins, Petrus and Paulus, the new Christian twins replacing Romulus and Remus. It even works out linguistically, Romulus and Remus, Petrus and Paulus, and we're home free. We've made the 4th century. It was a bit of a thing, but the emperor has joined us and is building our churches. and everything is fine. We've invented imperial Christianity. Only took 300 years. Okay.
Well, all right. So, again, like I said, you'll be shocked at just how clear and linear off the top of the head answers work. So I think the follow-up one, because I asked 2 questions last time, is really put us back in context for Paul's language around law, or maybe that 1 Corinthians 15 passage that through the resurrection, sin, law, death, these things that become subject to the Son, the Father, all in all. Because a lot of us didn't just get Constantinian Christianity. We got Luther dialing it up, right? So by the time we hear law, it's Calvin and Luther, and obviously what Paul's really pumped about is Jesus forgiving us if we lusted when we were 13.
And then you've lost Christianity. So much, honestly, is my own life. Let me use the word accidental. I mean, in Ireland, Ireland in the 40s, you cannot imagine how poor it was. You really can't. The towns I lived in were crossroads. So you didn't have a central, small towns couldn't have a high school, so they had a central boarding school. And please don't think the elite schools of here or England. They were necessities. Everyone went there. But what we had, again an accident, we had the receding tide of British imperialism, which had left behind its education system. So I had 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin every day in high school. Nothing to do with my genius or my intuition or foreseeing the future. It's just everyone else did it too. And you know what's really crazy? We did it in Gaelic. I mean, it awes me today to think that I was a native English speaker. Some of the students were, maybe half the students were native Gaelic speakers. That meant you were thinking in English, reading, say, Homer in Greek, and speaking in Gaelic, and knowing exactly how to play the professor, that I really know the word in Greek, but I can't get the Gaelic word. You hadn't done your homework, in other words. So it kind of was not, but when I decided to go into the monastery, I had 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin, which I didn't think was anything. I'd never seen the Bible or the New Testament, but I knew Virgil. I knew Roman imperial theology. I didn't know that was its name before I ever ran into Paul. It was just there, solidly in the background, waiting. Went into the monastery and they said, 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin, you're going to be a professor. Sure, whatever. So when I met Paul then, I wasn't meeting Paul through the Reformation or anything. It had nothing to do with my brilliance. I'd read Virgil first. In fact, I'm going to say this, you should never be allowed to read the New Testament without reading Virgil. Virgil's Aeneid, I'm talking about. Virgil's Aeneid, which is the New Testament of Roman imperial theology. Homer is its Old Testament. And you don't have to do it, honestly, you don't have to do it in Latin. You get the message in English. So when I read Paul, that was my matrix. And it really, honestly, people, it wasn't brilliance. It was a combination of that background and meeting Paul in the ruins of the Roman Empire. It was like, duh. I could not see it. So when I came to law, I'm not thinking, oh, this is an attack on Jewish law. We know all that nitpicking Pharisees. It was an attack primarily on Roman law or on human law. If human law at its best in civilization can crucify who is the Messiah, for us, the Son of God, the revelation of God, the image of God in sandals, if you like it. What do they do when civilization meets Jesus? They eliminate him publicly, legally, no lynching, legally. Well, then what price law? If this is the best, that civilization, don't think of Paul just going after the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is civilization in a toga. It's just the normalcy of civilization, first century Mediterranean style. Could be us today, somebody else some other time. But it's the normalcy of civilization. And it crucified somebody who used nonviolent resistance against us. Especially that, maybe. Because violent people, we know how to handle. That's what we have the legions for. And they do very good against violent people. But nonviolent people is it's tricky. We have to make a public demonstration about them. So no Roman imperial theology. And it's not that hard to know it. I mean, it's not like you have to become a Roman scholar. It's just the common matrix that all of us know if we're watching television and we hear something about Gaza. We don't think, Gaza, where's that? Oh, that must be the Old Testament. No, the matrix is, you know what's going on. In the first century, everyone knew what was going on. So Paul is talking the language of the first century that makes absolute sense to his readers, and we're reading his letters, which is bad manners. And when we don't understand them, we say, how stupid! If you're reading somebody else's letters and you don't understand it, even if you should be reading them, first of all, you don't say, how stupid. You say you don't understand it. You don't have the full story. So you try to read the letters, put it in the matrix of the first century until it makes sense of you. Then you can ask, what about me? What about today?
So I'm some people are probably catching their breath with the idea that the law has been connected to civilization, which kills the Christ and millions of others. Mm-hmm. You talked early about going and seeing the Byzantine pictures. Yeah. So when we start to see the cross as the symbol of civilizational power and law and order, and that's what put Jesus to death, why should we join, or how should we hear Paul's radical affirmation of resurrection as one that demands holding hands with Adam and Eve coming out of the grave?
Yeah, and sometimes I'm almost appalled at what you'd have to do, because most churches, the center is going to be the cross. Where's the resurrection? Paul would scream. Back to 1 Corinthians, he starts as, I've nothing to say to you except the Christ crucified. And then he ends with the resurrection. Those are like the frames of that. He would never, ever separate them. And in every one of those Greek Byzantine, Christ, who's taken Adam and Eve by the hand, it gets a little bit tricky, is carrying a cross. And he has a halo, with a cross on it, and you can see the wounds in most of them. He is the crucified one who's yanking Adam and Eve out. Now, in the beginning, a little bit anthropocentric, unfortunately, he's just reaching the hand of Adam because he's holding the cross. He's only got two hands still. And eventually, when he comes two-handed equal opportunity resurrection, you have an angel holding the cross, because you can't skip that. It is the crucified one who resurrects the human race, according to Paul. That's what we cannot separate. So you see the wounds and even the bifold gates. Hades is not hell, by the way, please. Hades is the place of death. That's why everyone's down there. And Hades as a person, he's not an evil person. He's not like Satan. He's just the gatekeeper of the place of death. And he's kind of standing, holding the doors. And you imagine the Messiah Christ go whoosh in, flattens poor old Hades down on the floor, the bifold gates in cruciform shape on top of Hades. And he's usually shown as an old, muscular man, old because he's been at this for a long time, and muscular because he's keeping all these people in and nobody gets out. So it's a magnificent image. And the cross is always there. In the halo, he's not carrying a great big wooden cross. But it's a symbolic cross, but it's definitely a cross. Now, when Sarah and I were doing this stuff on Cyprus and the Troodos Mountains, we had a driver. Sharon was her name. She was British, and she was married to a Cypriot, a Greek Cypriot. And she saw what we were doing. She was taking us around for a whole week, all of these tiny little village churches. And you go inside them, the size of this, and you're inside your story. It wraps all around you in frescoes. And she noticed we always went right to the one image right away. And she said, may I ask, why do you always go to the resurrection? And trying to get images, a lot of times they wouldn't want us to take photographs, so she'd go and distract the custodian. We had a great operation going. Anyway, and she said, my mom comes over here. I don't go to church, she said. My mom comes over here at Easter, and we always go to the Easter Vigil church. And it seems so unfair because the priest, who was an old man, no, it's the other way, but the priest is inside the doors, and he's an old man, and some young stud from the village pushes in the door, knocks the poor priest kind of flying. She said, could you explain to us why he does that? I had never heard of that being done ceremoniously. I'd never heard of it. Maybe it happens all the time in Greek Orthodox. They were reenacting this. Your local stud was Christ coming in, and the poor old priest, old, was representing Hades, and he's kind of knocked, carefully I hope, and the doors open. So it's still being done. And everywhere we went, very often we were there because of the time after Easter, simply because it was May. And every church we went into, red carpet up to it, Belgrade Cathedral, for example, red carpet up to it, and an icon was down, and it was always this scene. Jesus, Adam and Eve, usually the equal opportunity one, where each get a hand. So this is a living reality. And I'm going to say, including myself in this, when we talk about the resurrection, and we're talking about this, we're talking about Western resurrection. That's valid. We're ignoring all of Eastern Christianity, which is also there, and is just as old, if not older. The earliest ones of these come from the year 700, the earliest ones we can date. So you don't know what you're talking about, and I include myself in that before 2002. I was taking it for granted that the Western, as Reggie and Aaron said, that the Western was kind of it. But it's also the Eastern. So maybe we need a kind of amalgam, and Jesus redeems the human race and pops up and to tell us about it maybe and challenges us. But those are two different images.
We got one more question, so I'll only ask one. But
I talk long.
Oh no, I mean that's what everyone came here to hear. So you mentioned that Paul, in Paul's kind of Pharisaic background, there's a timeline where, now new creation starts because we have the general resurrection.
Yeah.
And then Jesus is raised and you're looking around and you're going, I thought Pharisees at general resurrections where the justice of God's demonstrated. I don't see that happening. Yeah. And one of the things that you and I've been talking about, I know is in the book, is an invitation to let Paul get a timeline wrong, but to get an invitation to participation in the divine right. And so I'd love for you to give us that and help people see how that heart of Paul is an invitation that the people with complicated relationships with Paul or disgruntled might move one step closer.
Okay. Paul definitely thinks this is all going to be over soon. Now, he is saying we are supposed to be, you Corinthians are supposed to be leading risen lives. That's what he's telling them. We're in between. It has begun. It will have a consummation. And he says it'll probably happen in our lifetime. So a major objection to Paul is he's totally wrong about the temporality, the timing. So we can dismiss him. Now, let me make up a parable. Once upon a time, there were two rulers, and both of their realms were infected with a serious disease. And one ruler said, let's not wear masks or anything, and this will all be over in a year. And the other ruler said, let's wear a mask, and this will be over in 3 months. What happened? It took a whole year. So the guy who said 3 months wear a mask was wrong on the time, but only 1,000 people died. The other guy was right about the year. It thinned the herd, as we said, and 1 million people died. So yeah, Paul is wrong about time. Off by 2,000 years and counting. Get over it. And a lot of my colleagues said Jesus was also wrong on time, and I'm not even going to argue with them. Okay, fine, he was wrong on time. You can be wrong on time unless your message is just about time, of course. I'll be finished in 5 minutes. If I'm not, then it's wrong. But Paul is wrong on time. We know that. And anyone who said the same thing as Paul, it'll be over soon, has been wrong so far and counting. Now, look, if you get up every morning your whole life and say, today I die, you're going to get it right once. Yeah. So, no, the more important message from Paul is his vision of how to run the world, if you want to put it that way. Vitally, radically necessary. Not just useful and nice and kind of, is it radically necessary? Is it giving maybe the only future we as a species? We are Homo sapiens. What an unimaginable oxymoron. Homo sapiens, the wise hominid. We are smart. We really are smart. But I don't think we're wise. I don't think, looking at the score so far, trajectory. So basically, Paul is wrong on time. Absolutely. Don't even get into an argument. Whatever about Jesus, it depends upon which text you can come from Jesus. Paul is definitely wrong. Thinks it within his own lifetime. But he is telling people that you're called to live, I think he'd say, a risen life. And the Corinthians are, because they saw it. They saw clearly the implications. That's why the resistance Paul gets from most of his people is magnificently honest. They're getting the message. And couldn't we be a good Roman and a good Christian? And the answer, of course, is, yeah, just wait 300 years. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Dom. So, for all of you with disgruntled or complicated relationships with Paul, when you go home and you tell that friend who is probably concerned you were here, you're like, no, I've met John Dominic Crossan, and I was eating some pizza, and he insisted that both he and Paul would like me to practice resurrection more. Mm-hmm. Then they'll be like, wow, see, the prayers for you were working. I had no idea.